Would you join me in our common confession as Christians? This is such a beautiful way to start our study together in the Word every week. That is, if you'll join me in saying, I am a child of God. I'm saved by grace. I live each day by faith. I'm ready to hear God's Word. I'm just going to give you a short piece as we stand in honor of the Word of God. This is a small piece of the story we're going to look at today. David has had the opportunity to kill King Saul, and he chose not to, because Saul was chosen by God, and David didn't think he had the right to anoint himself as an executioner in the hands of God. Once Saul leaves this cave and goes down into the valley, David comes out of the same cave and stands on the edge of the cave and says this. It says, Then David shouted to Saul, Why do you listen to the people who say I'm trying to harm you? This very day you can see with your own eyes it isn't true, for the Lord placed you at my mercy back there in the cave, and some of my men told me to kill you, but I spared you. For I said to myself, I will never harm the king, because he is the Lord's anointed one. Look, my father, at what I have in my hand. It's a piece of the hem of your own robe. I cut it off, but it didn't kill you. This proves that I'm not trying to harm you and that I've not sinned against you, even though you have been hunting for me to kill me. What a remarkable response. May God bless this reading of his word, as people said. Amen. Have a seat. We'd like to dismiss our kids for their lesson this morning. And let me say, as they pass from the room, and listen very carefully, at the end of our announcements, I have a closing announcement. I'm going to do a very, very brief presentation. We're going to change Children's Church. We're not going to change it by getting rid of it. We're going to change it by expanding it to Sunday night. So I want to just share that information with you at the end of our service this morning. Please listen carefully to it and ask yourself, between your heart and your God, do I have a place in this? That's all we ask. You know, we understand, we are painfully aware as leaders of this church that the church is an all-volunteer organization. We can't coerce or co-opt anybody to do anything. We all serve. I mean, the reason this church does such a great job in everything it does is because we have people that step up and take care of business. VBS doesn't happen because we have a paid staff that comes in and does it. It happens because 50 people volunteer to do 20 different things and do it really well. That's what makes a church like this go. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Now we're going to put more on you. We're going to ask for a little more. But there's a reason. There's a reason. We want to encourage young parents to be here. We want to encourage the parents of our teens to be here on Sunday night so that they can fellowship and you can fellowship. We all win that way. So anyway, let's talk about new directions. We've talked about several things you can do to take new direction in your life, things you need to rethink, attitudes you might need to work on that are going to take you in a fresh new direction and change the dynamic in your life to move you closer to a walk with God and closer to a walk to the image of Christ. And that's our goal as Christians. We've been looking at a series of these stories from the Bible where it illustrates what happens when a person actually buys in to a certain attitude in life and practices it. And we've seen some really, really amazing things in some of these stories, and none any more so than this one. So today we want to talk a little bit about respecting authority. Understanding how things work. If I'm on a job, I may not agree with everything the boss says to do, but that person's the boss. And, I got two options. I can go along or I can find another job. And people who work for themselves find out sometimes they're not very good bosses either. So, this respect for authority thing's important. We're going to look at 1 Samuel 24 and to be King David, but not at that point in time. In our day and time, it's popular to question authority, isn't it? Boy, all this conspiracy theory there's conspiracy theories about everything now. You know what the root of most conspiracy theories is? Question of authority. The guys in charge are lying to us. The guys in charge can't be trusted. The guys in charge are basically bad guys. The guys in charge are doing nefarious things behind the scenes that they aren't telling us all about. Now, is there some of that going on? Probably. But is that really true of everything around us? Well, I don't think so. But it is popular to show disrespect for authority. I heard an interesting statement, and I'm trying to think of who said it. I don't remember. It was a coach, a retired coach. They were interviewing him on a sports program, and he was talking about several of these incidents where some of the athletes have been arrested, sometimes under duress because of things they've done. And he said, and of course he was African American. He says, I told my son when he was growing up, when my son was a younger boy, we had a conversation. And he says, I explained to my son, anytime a police officer tells you to stop, you stop. And if he tells you to hold your hands up, you hold your hands up. I don't care if you're right or wrong. I don't care if you're innocent or guilty. It doesn't matter. If he tells you to stop and he tells you to put your hands on the car or whatever, you do what he says. Because otherwise, only bad things can happen. Now, I don't think that, and it's interesting, 3 or 4 of the other people who were being interviewed, who were also African American, by the way, well-known athletes, said, you know something, we've had that same conversation with our kids. You just don't do things that are going to cause a problem. And yet you have some people that not only won't comply with what an officer says, they'll actually get in his face and try to make an issue out of it because of a disrespect of authority. Now, are the authorities always fair and right in what they do? Of course not. But do they usually have a reason? Hopefully. I'm not bringing that issue up to be controversial because it could be applied to many other things. I've seen people do the same thing on the job, at school, and by the way, in the church as well. Yeah. There are some people that just love to defy anything the elders suggest. Now, elders need to know who they answer to. Okay? And when they speak, they need to speak only with the authority of Christ. But even in the church today, we question God. We'll see God's revealed will in a certain subject, and then we'll say, I've had people tell me this. Well, I don't agree with that. Well, I don't think God cares whether you agree with it. God doesn't say, I'm going to make a rule that says, thou shalt not commit adultery. All those in favor say aye. All those, I'm sorry, the nays carry. Okay, well, you can go ahead and commit adultery then. God doesn't operate that way. God's the divine, supreme creator of the universe. He gets to make all the rules. Because it's not that he has better cards than me. It's that he holds all the cards. I'm not even been invited to the game. So God says, this is my will, and I do one of two things. I either respect the authority of God and accept that will and try to follow it, or I rebel against the authority of God and put my soul at risk. And that's true in anything like this, So I guess to carry the analogy over, if God tells you to stop and put your hands up, then you stop and put your hands up. Why? Because God said to do it. I don't have to have any better reason than that. And so, but it applies even in the church today. We need to think about our attitude toward God and whether we really take him seriously. In Scripture, when you read in the Bible, and this is true on both the positive and the negative side, even the powerful are expected to show respect. Remember what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he stood on his balcony in the book of Daniel, and he says, "Look at this vast kingdom I have built and how powerful I am, almost like a god." And God took his mind away from him. And when he had spent years away from his throne in this period of insanity, when God finally gave his good mind back to him, he came back and the first thing he said was, "Well, now I understand that there's a God in heaven and he made everything and I only am allowed to rule because of his goodness. And so, yeah, I get it." So we got examples of guys that kind of buck the system and pay the price. You remember when God chose Moses to lead the people, and then Achan and his family, or not Achan and his family, but there were others in the land or among the people who said, "Well, we don't accept the leadership of Moses." And God struck the guy's whole family dead. Now, that's a rather dramatic way to deal with it, but what's God saying? I don't really care whether you like Moses or not. He's the one I've chosen. You're going to follow him, or you won't be following anybody anywhere because you won't have anybody to go anywhere. So you've got these things going on all the time. You know, Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." You know, not everybody who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter heaven, but he who does the will of my Father. That's respect for authority. And so that's a very important thing. Let's look at David for a minute. David and king. Now, the first king of Israel, once Israel decided to form itself into a kingdom, which, by the way, did not terribly please God, they decided they wanted a king like everybody else. So God chose a man for them. His name was Saul. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. Very tall, very handsome, very, very shy person. But God allowed Saul to become king. He was anointed by the prophet Samuel. So Saul is the king. He's ruling. So who has the authority? Saul does. Whether we like it or not. Who chose Saul? God did. So he is, as David says later, he is the Lord's anointed. God made him king. Okay, if God made him king, then whose right is it to unmake him? God. That's David's attitude. God made you king. God can unmake you. And it's kind of like the idea of life itself. You know, I live as long as God chooses to let me live. The day I die is the day the Lord chose for me to die. I'm not going to complain about that. I have no right to complain about it because it's within the sovereignty of God to make that decision. So, you know, this is the situation that's set up. Now, we all remember David and Goliath, right? Now, David had already been anointed surreptitiously. I like that word. That's a good one, wasn't it? Behind the scenes and under the table, David had already been anointed to succeed Saul as king because Saul got too big for his britches. Saul was in authority over Israel, but Saul was not in authority over God. And when Saul decided he had bigger britches on than God did, God says, "Okay, I'm going to start setting things in motion to replace you." And so David, the boy, was anointed to be the next king. At this point, in God's system of doing things, David is the king in waiting. David's attitude is, I will become king when God tells me to be king. He never took the attitude, well, I've been anointed. I can just take this guy out anytime I want to and become king because I've already been anointed. It's not David's attitude. He says, hey, he always acknowledges God's in control of all this. He'll do it in his own good time. So David goes to check on his brothers, and that's when the incident with Goliath comes up. You know, David kills Goliath, which is an incredible supernatural victory. And David immediately becomes a rock star. I mean, this guy becomes a hero. He doesn't even wear armor. He goes out with a sling and 5 smooth stones with his loincloth on, whacks this guy in the head with one shot. Doesn't even need. He picked 5 stones. He wasted 4 of them. All he needed was 1 stone and the guiding hand of God. Hit the guy in the temple. shattered the side of his skull, brain hemorrhage, the guy drops dead. David cuts his head off, holds it up, probably took both hands. The people cheer a victory. They launch an invasion against the Philistines, run them off the field of battle, and David becomes a rock star. In fact, he had become so popular that all the ladies, when Saul returns from the battle, all the ladies, of course, line the streets to celebrate the great victory. It's a triumphal march, and Saul's riding along, and he's, I'm Saul, I'm the king. And they're singing this song. You ever heard some of these British soccer fans up in the stands singing their songs during the team's game? You ever heard that? They'll stand up there and they'll sing these rousing songs. That's their team song and all of that. Well, they got a kind of a victory song. They're all singing the song, na 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 na, na 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 na, hey hey, goodbye. That's what they're singing. That's right there in the Bible. So they're singing that song. Either that or the other one that they're singing on the other side is, we are the champions. So, it's one or the other. And if you coordinate them, it's really impressive. Anyway, they're singing these songs, and all of a sudden, in the middle of these, we are the champions, and na, 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 and all of that, Saul starts hearing, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And he's like, wait, I've never heard that song, and I don't much like the way it sounds. Because all of a sudden, David is getting more attention and more credit than the king. Now, at first, he kind of smiles and waves and laughs it off like, oh, well, you know how people are. But the more he thinks about this, and this is what happens when you feel offended and you dwell on it, it starts to eat him up. It starts to devour him. Besides that, the Lord infested him with a troubling spirit. He began to devolve into a kind of a paranoia. He got more and more violent. And by the way, David attached to King Saul's court and played the lyre for him, composed music for him, eased his soul. But still, the more Saul thought about it, he just went crazy. And he would try to kill it. He threw spears at David. He tried to run him off. Finally, David just had to run away. Well, at that point, Saul decides, that's not good enough. I can't. And when Saul found out David had been anointed by Samuel to be the next king, that sealed the deal. And at that point, Saul, it just made Saul insanely jealous, to the point that he launched a campaign to chase David all over the country, hunt David down, and kill him. He's going to annihilate the guy. And he had on one occasion, on the story we're going to look at in a couple of minutes, he had 3,000 armed troops after David, chasing him through the wilderness, chased him all over the countryside, to where David ends up down in the south in the cave areas, the desolate caved areas, just running from cave to cave and valley to valley, just getting shelter where he could. Now, the thing I want us to notice here, and there's a lot of intrigue, and we could look at the dynamics of this relationship as it devolves, but I want us to look today, if we could, for a few minutes at David's response. Now, what would be the normal response? If you are dedicated to killing me, what's the common sense response? How's the easiest way to solve this problem? I kill you. I mean, if you've made it obvious that it's me or you, it's you. That's not a hard choice for me. I mean, if you look at me and say, I'm coming to your house this weekend, and when I walk in that door, I want you to know I'm going to have a gun in my hand, and I'm going to kill you. I intend to kill you. Do you think I'm going to be sitting on my couch drinking sweet tea and reading a book when you come to the door? I'm at least going to have the door locked and some security there, and most likely, if I am able to, I'm going to be prepared to protect myself. And I'm not going to invite you in. I'm not going to do it. Because I know what's coming. Okay, Saul is after David. He's dogging this poor guy everywhere. I mean, just making his life miserable. David's living literally like an animal. Just hand to mouth, place to place, moving all the time, one step ahead. Not always one step ahead, we're going to see in just a minute. Because when we turn into this situation in chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, the one step ahead is now 2 steps away. Literally. We're going to read through this story for a minute, but I want you to watch how this story develops. Near En-Gedi, En-Gedi is over on the shores of the Dead Sea. It's a very deep, dark, desolate place. It's very much deserted. There are a bunch of gully washes in that area, a lot of caves in the limestone above that area. In fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a series of 5 caves not far from En-Gedi, probably 10 miles north of there is where the Dead Sea Scroll caves were found. So there are literally hundreds and hundreds of caves, kind of like White County. You know, I mean, we got caves everywhere in this county. Well, it's kind of that way there, except there's no trees and there's no grass, and it's just kind of desolate. So David has gone down to the En-Gedi area, and they have found up in one of the cliff walls, they have found a cave. And he and a handful of his security guard they're up in that cave. They've gone up there and they're just kind of catching their breath and trying to relax a little bit. And the next thing they know, up the valley comes Saul and 3,000 of his armed soldiers. I mean, right in, they're camped in the valley right below where they're in the cave. And it's like, oh man, now what if they search the caves? I mean, we put up a good fight for about 3 minutes. That's about the size of it. So David finds himself trapped in a cave. Here's the way the writer tells the story. He says, after Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. The goats get up on those cliff sides and run the rocks up there. In fact, that was how the first Dead Sea Scroll was found. An Arab boy was chasing his goat and couldn't find him, and he found a cave and threw a rock down in it, and he heard a pot break. And when he crawled down in there later to find out what it was, he found the first 5 scrolls and took them to sell. So it's a very common place for shepherds to run their goats. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave now I'm not trying to embarrass you here, but the Bible's pretty frank. He went into a cave to relieve himself. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding further back in the very cave. So, is the king vulnerable? Well, you would think so. He's gone into the cave to potty. It's a private place, and he's gone in there to potty. So while he kind of partially disrobes, and while he's going to the bathroom, David and the boys are in the back of the cave, hiding in the shadows back here. Well, now I'm going to tell you something. If you're going to do somebody in, it's a good time to do it. It's not like he's got his sword in his hand waiting to fight you, right? And the purpose of this story being told the way it is in such graphic language is to show you the absolute helplessness of Saul. He is totally vulnerable. He is totally unable to defend himself. In other words, if you're looking to kill the king, he's easy pickings. Okay, now, if you're David and you know God's anointed you to be king, now how can you be king if Saul hunts you down and kills you? Is this, and here's the way we play this game, this is a sign from God. God's just put this guy right here in front of me. It's like God is saying, okay, Dave, now's your time. Take him out, buddy. And it would be easy if you're in David's situation, wouldn't it, to think to yourself, this is a gift from God. He has given, God is ready for me to become king, and he has shown me that by putting this guy right here in front of me. I mean, it's like God's just yelling at me, kill him, come on. I mean, if it's you or him, and I've already said you're the next one, it's time to take this boy out. But when given this chance, because David's standing in the back, fully armed with his sword in his hand, he ready to defend himself. When given the chance, David refused. Look at the text. Let's read what it says. Listen to David's men. Hey, by the way, can your best friend sometimes be the voice of Satan? Listen to this. Now, these are the most trusted people he has. Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. Now that's close. I can't imagine Saul taking his outer robe off and just throwing it across the other end of the cave. It's laying right next to him, and David cuts off a piece of it with his knife. But then David's conscience began bothering him. By the way, your conscience is only as good as you've trained it to be. Is David's conscience trained right? Yeah. He has a respect for the king and for God's order of things and for the sovereignty of God to let God choose when and how the transition takes place. He doesn't see himself as an angel of God's vengeance. It bothered him because he cut Saul's robe. He said to his men, God forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him. So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. He could have looked at him and said, listen, I can't do it. Would one of you guys do it for me? That's another good way out, isn't it? And then David could say, hey, I didn't do it. I got the robe. They got the king. You know how men are? Loyalty. But what happens next? Well, Saul gets done with what Saul's doing, slips his robe back on, walks out of the cave, works his way back down the hillside into the valley, and then he hears this voice, and he and his troops look up, and in the very cave where Saul had just gone, the kind of En-Gedi porta potty, he looks up, and there's David and his armed soldiers standing there like this with their swords in their hands at the mouth of the cave. And David is holding up this piece of cloth. He's got this piece of cloth in his hand like this. And he's waving it at Saul. And he confronts Saul with what Saul's doing and what David could have done but didn't do. After Saul had left the cave and gone on his way, David came out and shouted after him, my lord the king. And when Saul looked around, David bowed low before him. This is a symbolic act that says, I respect you. David has no reason to respect this man. But he does have reason to respect the fact that he's God's chosen one. And so we talk sometimes about whether you respect the president, you respect the office. And there's a long tradition of that goes clear back to David and Saul. There's a biblical basis for that. He is the ruler. You know, the Bible says all governments are appointed by God in one form or another. And so you honor that. So he addresses the king, and then he shouts to Saul, and this is the passage we read. Basically, why are you listening to these people who say I want to harm you? You know, you want to see how much I want to harm you? Look at this. I just cut this off your robe while you were in the bathroom. I was that close to you. The fact that I cut it off tells you I had a death-dealing weapon in my hand. Your robe was 2 feet from you. It would have been just as easy for me to cut off a piece of you as it would have been to cut off a piece of your robe. That was mine to do, but you understand, you're God's anointed. I honor that. I respect your authority. I chose not to do it because in my heart and my conscience, it was wrong for me to assume the sovereignty of God in this situation. If God wants you gone, God will find a way to take you out without having to use me to do it. Well, it's interesting to look at Saul's response. We're just going to roll right past that, but you can read that in your own studies. But in doing this, David gained Saul's support. I mean, at least temporarily. Because, hey, put yourself in Saul's shoes. And you begin to realize how easy it would have been. And you begin to realize that there's a sense in which you now owe your life to this boy, whether you like it or not. Look at what he says. He gained Saul's support. Let's look at these verses real quick. When David had finished speaking, Saul called back, "Is that really you, my son David?" Now, you got to be careful what Saul says. He can't be trusted. But then he began to cry. Now, that's usually a sign of genuineness. When we, and those of you that teach will appreciate this, when we're dressing down a kid for doing something they shouldn't do, if you can ever break them into the point of crying, then you get the feeling that maybe you've made a little progress. Because you have some of them that'll stand there and stone cold stare at you. They'll give you the Charles Manson look. Give me a chance, I'll carve a swastika on my head and stick a knife in your back. But if you can get a kid to cry, it almost is a way of admitting on his part that, yeah, I do have a feeling of guilt here. And that's what Saul does. He said to David, "You're a better man than I am." By the way, that's a true statement. "For you have repaid me good for evil." Does Paul not tell us to do that in Romans? Yeah. "Yes, you've been amazingly kind to me today, for when the Lord put me in a place where you could have killed me, you didn't do it. Who else would let his enemy get away when he had him in his power? May the Lord reward you well for the kindness you've shown me today, and now I realize that you are surely going to be king and that the kingdom of Israel will flourish under your rule. Now swear to me by the Lord that when that happens, you will not kill me." He says, by the way, promise me you won't harm my family. Why? What's the normal order of business when a new line of rulers takes over? You eliminate competition. By the way, David did not do that. In fact, one of Saul's sons ended up being adopted into the royal family and eating at David's table for the rest of his days. So David honored this promise. David promised this to Saul, which tells you something else. This is an integrity issue. He kept his word. Saul went home. David and his men went back to their stronghold. I mean, they weren't going to stand in a circle, hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and everybody go home happy. They're still on opposite sides of this fence, but at least they've made some peace. And it was because David respected God's order of things and honored that. Now, let me give you 4 quick lessons, and really they all follow one upon another. Number 1, as you walk through life, expect to be mistreated. I mean, come on. It's going to happen. Because there's more of them than there are of us. And that's always been that way, and it always will be that way, and that's not ever going to change. You're going to occasionally have a boss who's a real jerk or jerkette. Depends on whether it's male or female, but it's all the same. You're going to have bosses that don't treat you right. You're going to have employees that abuse you. You may have a mate that mistreats you from time to time or says and does things that just aren't appropriate. I see you shaking your head. No, I mean, it happens, doesn't it? We're all going to be mistreated at one time. Is there anybody in this room who's never been mistreated by anybody? No. See, we all know that, don't we? So let's get the Pollyanna glasses off. Now, you don't go around inviting mistreatment. Please abuse me so I'll feel like I'm suffering for Jesus. Yeah, right. I'm a Christian, please slap me. It's like, okay, whatever. But I'll tell you this. You're going to be mistreated. And not necessarily even because you're a Christian. You may just be mistreated because you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You may be in the pathway of somebody that's just mad at the world, and you just happen to be the best part of the world that's around them right at that time. You ever had that happen to you? You ever caught somebody when they're mad at their husband or wife, and you get the whipping for it? Yeah, we've all done that. Kid comes to school mad at his or her parents, and guess who they yell at? They yell at you. You're going to be mistreated, but I'm going to tell you this. Don't be shocked if you have feelings of revenge. Who gets the foul in a football game when a little scuffle takes place? Who always gets called for the penalty? The second guy. Isn't that true? It always happens that way. Some guy pushes you, or as he gets up, he puts his foot on his cleats on your face and pushes down a little bit. And when you get up, what's your first reaction? Hey! Pop him in the back of the head, and then the flag goes up, and your team gets a 15-yard penalty, and he walks off saying, yo, brother, what's happening? You know, it happens all the time. Hey, life works that way. A lot of times the nasty folks in life will step on you with their cleats, and then you get, if you retaliate, you get flagged for it. It happens. Don't be shocked if you have feelings of revenge. Everybody does. You're not going to convince me for a minute when Jesus was on the cross that the thought didn't cross his mind, boy, I could take these guys out in a heartbeat. I believe with all my heart that every time that Roman scourge came across the flesh of his back, there was at least a passing thought in his mind, oh, I'd like to let him know what this feels like. Tempted in all ways, like as we. Yet without, yeah. See, if Jesus had sought revenge at the cross, there wouldn't be anybody left. So don't beat yourself up when you have those get even feelings. That's normal. But when wrong, don't fight in the flesh. Just resist that urge. The first reaction is, I'm going to fight in the flesh. I'm going to get even. I'm going to do them in. I'm going to talk about them. I'm going to hit them. I'm going to spread a rumor about them. I'm going to undermine them. That's not God's way. And I'm going to tell you a little secret. It's one thing that distinguishes us from them. It is one of those things that distinguishes a Christian from the world. When God says, come ye out from among them, that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about physically walking across a line. He's talking about not crossing certain moral and emotional lines. When my heart says revenge, my faith has to say, back off, son. That's not going to get the job done. And that leads to our last point, which is this. Leave life's injustices to God. Trust me, he will settle it. And when he does, oh, is it going to be something to see. Everybody out there, you know, all these identity thieves that think they're so slick and cool and they've gotten away with all of this, wait until God, you know, there won't be no identity, nothing when you get before God. Let God handle it. Number one, God can sort it out and do it right. And the punishment will fit the crime, whatever it is. Now let me give you a verse and we're going to close on this. This is the verse that's so important, and this is Paul's advice. Well, it's his command to us. Listen to this. Dear friends, never take revenge. By the way, did you say try not to take revenge most of the time or do the best you can? What does he say? Never, never, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures itself say, I will take revenge. I will pay them back, says the Lord. You know what that tells me? If I seek revenge myself, I am actually usurping the sovereign authority of God. I am taking it upon myself to do what God says only he has the right to do. And that takes us right back full circle to the cave at En-Gedi and the young boy David hiding with his soldiers in the back of the cave with the opportunity to slit the throat of the king he's already been anointed to replace. And thinking to himself, I'd love to do it. And even the world around him was saying, go ahead, son, he's got it coming. But him saying to himself, but I'm not God. and therefore I can't do God's business. If God is angry enough at this man to take him out, God will find a way to do it. And he did, in God's own time, as he always does. Isn't that an interesting story? But, this revenge thing has to do with respect for authority, respecting God's sovereignty in the world. So that's just something for you to think about. And as we try to take good directions in our lives, one of the things we need to do is to always remember the pecking order. And no matter how high you peck on the order, you're not at the top. And you never will be. And you don't need to be. Because I found out in my life I'm not qualified to be at the top of the order. I'm not that smart. And that means that sometimes as number 2, you've got to take your orders from number 1. And you may not like them, but you take them anyway. If you're not a Christian, that pecking order becomes very important. Jesus says, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. If you don't believe, you're going to be lost. God the Father says, if you don't accept my Son in the day of judgment, that's the first question God's going to ask you. Did you submit your life to my Son? Have you become a Christian? If you can't get past that one, nothing else is going to matter. You can have a laundry list 100 miles long of all the good things you've ever done in your life, and it won't amount to anything because you don't know the one person that you have to know to get to heaven. If you're not a Christian, we encourage you to come this morning. Confess Jesus, be baptized into Christ, wash your sins away, start your walk with God. If you're a Christian, hey, we've all got work to do on this one, don't we? This is one of those, hope you get it right, but probably not all at once. But we can certainly let God bring us to conviction on it. If we need to pray about it, let us know.